Mr. Kalven is a human rights activist. He is a writer and executive director for the Invisible Institute. He has been a social worker and a freelance journalist. But his work in the Invisible Institute is really, I think, probably the largest reflection of what he's going to talk about here today. And they're a nonprofit company, which is a journalistic production company to offer resources to journalists and with the specific goal of expanding and operationalizing transparency. Now, Mr. Kalven himself has a storied and long history of work in a variety of fronts, some of which is entertaining. I was making fun of him earlier because he wrote an article back in 1984 that was in The Nation, which was then being used by Senator Patrick Leahy in Judge Bork's appointment hearings in the Senate. So he's had a wide variety from First Amendment law and judicial analysis to what he's better known for now, which I think comes down to seeking accountability in terms of our structures and specifically our police structures in society. He just this last February won the 2015 George Polk Award for his article 16 Shots, which was published in Slate. And that's the article where Mr. Kalven challenged, and sort of was the first person to directly challenge, the police narrative regarding the shooting of Laquan McDonald by Officer Van Dyke. And in terms of the impact of that article, he predicted that the release of the video was not going to be as exculpatory as the police indicated, and there'd be an ensuing firestorm. And certainly his predictions on that front have all come to be true. But more significant to me, in terms of the work Mr. Kalven has done, as sensational and amazing and important as that case and that story is the sort of broader institutional work. In the case of Kalven versus City of Chicago is a major significant lawsuit and win, where Mr. Kalven was able to get the right to open up and make public record the reports and filings of complaints of police misconduct against officers. And that opened up thousands and thousands of records, both from 2010 or 11 to 2015, as well as different periods in the prior decade. And the city of Chicago, sort of following in light with that and attempting to make itself more transparent thanks to the effort of Mr. Kalven, has promised, although there's currently fighting and litigation between the Fraternal Order of the Police, but has opened up all police complaints of misconduct since 1967. And that, if successful, will be a huge step forward in terms of opening up institutional tools for accountability. And what's more, they were able to take, along with several people that work with Mr. Kalven, and put that online in a database called the Citizens Police Data Project, where over 50,000 complaints of misconduct are able to be reviewed and analyzed. And I think it's amazing. I think we're incredibly lucky to get Mr. Kalven here. And please, I think he'll probably speak about it much more intelligently than I can. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Kalven.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I recently was talking with a police officer friend, one of the rarest of individuals, a whistleblower within the police department, who's a major source for a story I'm working on that'll be published next month. And she observed to me with great feeling that we live in a broken city, referring to Chicago. We live in a broken city. And that phrase has stayed with me. And what she was referring to was a state of our civic life in Chicago where there are whole broad communities that want nothing to do with the police, will not cooperate with police investigations, don't call the police when they are threatened themselves or know of a crime. And increasingly, coupled with that phenomena, we have a police force that in these last months has undergone a kind of Copernican revolution in their understanding of their jobs, and they're increasingly disinclined to interact with the community. So, police now, and there's been some reporting on this, but it's a pretty pronounced phenomena. There are police officers taking early retirement, once they hit 20 years, which is when they're fully vested in their pensions. Police officers, good frontline police officers, the sort of people you want in your community who are asking to be put behind desks, which in the past would have been seen as, onerous and undesirable. And I think very broadly, police officers not wanting to be first on a call, when a 911 call comes in. And so you have now communities, and these are communities where there is the most violent crime, who won't cooperate with the police, want no interaction with the police, and a police department that's less and less inclined to interact with the community. And in between, we have bodies falling. There's been a really significant spike in shootings and in homicides, in recent months. So I want to, I want to ultimately talk about this extraordinary moment we're in and the prospects for enduring reform. But before that, I think I want to stay for a while with the sort of diagnosis of the place we find ourselves. Because I think one of the forms of denial, and denial is a big part of this dynamic we're in, is to sort of rush past diagnosis to prescription, before we've really comprehended the full extent of what we're dealing with. As some of you may know, if you know anything about my background, this, my engagement with these issues starts some 15 years ago in high-rise public housing on the south side of Chicago, the South State Street corridor, where I worked for close to 15 years at a public housing development called Stateway Gardens, which was at the northern end of Robert Taylor. And, I assume people have memories of that world, but we've undergone an extraordinary, the city policies with respect to high-rise public housing were called the Plan for Transformation. And I used to joke when it was starting out that it was this Orwellian name, the idea that an institution that hadn't been able to provide maintenance or public safety at the most minimal level was going to provide transformation. But in some ways the joke is on me, because it really has been transformative in that, entire communities, an entire city within the city has disappeared, and beyond disappeared, been erased, so that if you don't have really immediate and vivid and acute memories of what existed, you can't recover it. I mean, so high-rise public housing in Chicago is as gone and utterly gone as the Warsaw Ghetto. I mean, the same kind of dynamic. I lived through that process as a daily presence at Stateway Gardens. Worked there in multiple roles, and I didn't go there first as a writer. I was finishing a book about something else. Was working on a book about something else, and so it was this kind of parallel career. As an organizer, I created something called the Neighborhood Conservation Corps that was directed towards creating alternatives for young men in the gangs and the street organizations, and ultimately became part of. I mean, in retrospect, it even amazes me, but became part of the resident leadership as an advisor to the resident council. So was involved over years in negotiations with CHA, HUD, the police, ultimately private developers on behalf of the residents. It's a role I continue to perform on the west side of Chicago for former residents of the Henry Horner homes. So I was really, really immersed in this community. Ultimately had an office, a 5-bedroom unit where we were squatters in a high-rise, where if you'd come to visit me, drug dealers would have ushered you in as sort of my doorman, but very, very civil. You want to go see Jamie? Oh, take you in. So I had, over time, a vantage point that has shaped all of my work since then in being a daily presence in an utterly abandoned community. And, we can talk about low-income black and brown neighborhoods in Chicago, and I think it's appropriate to call them abandoned. There's this way of talking in sociology and journalism where we talk about isolated urban poverty. Well, these Soweto-like developments were in the center of the city, surrounded by institutional capacity, and there's a profound difference between being isolated, as if poor people moved away from us, and being abandoned. Abandonment states a relationship. And it's hard to even express the degree of abandonment of high-rise public housing in its last decade. Already, a stigmatized, criminalized population. It was more like boat people offshore, really, than an integral part of the city. And the policy that the city came up with was fundamentally to sink the boats one by one. So for me, this was, I don't want to say a laboratory, but that sounds cold. I mean, it was an incredible setting for exploring a set of themes about radical structures of racial inequality and class inequality, but also ultimately police abuse and police impunity. Because I would see, and it didn't, there's a lot to take in public housing. I was engaged on multiple fronts. So it was a while before I saw what I ultimately could not unsee, which was patterns of policing that were just sort of daily. It wasn't the exceptional, egregious departure from the norm. These were sort of daily patterns that were so different from my middle-class expectations, of how the police behave. I mean, the first thing is the police were just unresponsive, and I think it remains the case with neighborhoods, where most of the crime occurs, that they're both under-policed and over-policed at the same time. So, nobody called the police with any expectation that they would come. They wouldn't. But they were, another kind of presence in the development. The high-rise public housing in Chicago was a de facto vice zone. It was allowed to be a vice zone. It's where drugs were sold. And it was essentially permitted. So the policing strategies were sort of containment, like you would in South Africa under apartheid, contain these. And both South Side and West Side, the developments were also contained by expressway moats, the Dan Ryan, the Eisenhower, but it meant that there was a kind of drive-by service for people coming off the expressway to buy drugs. So the police presence was mostly with reference to narcotics enforcement and the drug trade, and it took the form of, the term of art was hitting the building, and gang tactical officers driving at great speed up on the sidewalk into these open-air lobbies where the drug dealing was going on. The young men, engaged in that form of commerce, running up into the building. This was a cat and mouse thing, completely futile, never accomplished anything. But that, so in that context, there was a tremendous amount of just daily, I rarely saw an arrest that didn't involve excessive force. That in some other community wouldn't be excessive force. Corruption, I never saw, I'm now investigating, major corruption in those years, a protection racket of police officers who exacted a tax from drug dealers to deal in certain buildings and then protected them. I never saw that stuff. I was close to the ground, but I saw daily officers coming and taking money and drugs off young men and not making arrests. So say, this is your bail money. You're bailing out here rather than down at the station. And the residents at Sayway used to joke about these open-air lobbies that were the drug marketplaces as the policeman's ATM machine. If a policeman was short on his rent or mortgage or, wanted to go out to dinner, just come and take money off these kids and not make an arrest. So you sort of saw this stuff from day to day, and some of the most disturbing things to me were the smallest things. So just, the language, the offensive racist language that was so easily used, and actually by African American officers as well as white officers. A kind of perverse pleasure in just toying with people. I remember an instance where a number of heroin addicts had been sort of rounded up in one of these buses, and the officers thought it would be amusing to have them have a race, to race a block to see who would go to jail and who wouldn't. But that kind of thing is just, what we don't account for enough, I think, is if there are spaces that those, whether police officers or others, who are inclined and disposed to be abusive, whatever that means, corrupt, racist, violent, wretched towards women, they will gravitate to that space. And part of what happens there is just a kind of perverse toying with other human beings because you can. So some of those smaller things, or there were officers who could be counted on to show. Remember, this is the poorest of the poorest of the poor in the city. Officers who could be counted on to show up at places like Stateway on check day, on the day that people got their welfare checks. And, as they're leaving the currency exchange, there were no banks in the neighborhood, to rip them off as they were headed to the grocery store or wherever they were headed. So, a place where that kind of thing can happen, the small things as well as the big, is a place where anything can happen. And so what sort of took hold for me as a question, I now routinely use the word impunity. I knew the word then, but it wasn't an active part of my vocabulary. What I saw in those years and experienced in those years in the most immediate, vivid way, just sort of a visceral phenomenon, not an abstraction, was what impunity looks like. How police officers behave when they know that there is no chance of discipline or punishment. And the question that formed, given that experience on the ground, and I began, over a period of years, to document it, to write about it. And when I did, because I'd been there for a long time, I was in people's lives, I was useful presence, I had extraordinary sources. There were 2 different gang nations, so-called. I had lots of sources within the gangs. Everybody knew me. I had, there were all sorts of police officers I had relationships with who were kind of appalled by some of these dynamics. So when I began to document it, I had a lot of sources to draw on. And so what began as this kind of human rights documentation of these harms, of sort of the particular blows from particular hands inflicted on particular bodies, gave rise to a question that sort of has driven my work and the work of a number of colleagues, other journalists and civil rights attorneys since, which is what set of institutional conditions would have to exist for what I'm seeing to be the case. So I started with a sense, I started at that end where this was happening, this was real, I knew, I was registering it on my nerve endings, and I was seeing it from day to day over years. No question about it. But the driving question was, how would the world have to be organized for this to be happening? And what would those conditions look like? And that led to, I think, half a dozen federal civil rights suits that either arose out of my reporting or I had a hand in with colleagues from the University of Chicago legal clinic, civil rights lawyers and students working on these cases, and culminated, so these were cases asserting sort of systemic harms, systemic patterns within the department that implicated from the superintendent down, not just the defendant officers, but the entire institution, because they had sort of broken systems that they knew were broken and didn't fix. And that was the thesis of these cases. And that allowed for, in the course of civil discovery, for all sorts of information and data to be secured from the city. And but what happens in cases like this is it comes under what's called a consent decree, or a protective order, which means that the parties can exchange the information, but it can't be made public. I went into federal court on behalf of the public, challenged the protective order, and prevailed in federal court. We were ultimately overruled in the Seventh Circuit. And then the case kind of rebooted in state court. I won't tell you all the adventures we had legally, but culminated after close to a decade of litigation with Kalven versus Chicago, this decision. And I should say, I don't like titles. People want to call me the executive director of the experiment. I say I'm associated with the Invisible Institute. But I do like the title of that lawsuit. I like that. I do like that. And it established the principle that police misconduct records in Illinois belong to the public. They belong to the public, subject to a few reasonable redactions. Nobody wants to know a policeman's social security number, but we do want to know his or her disciplinary history. So we now, have all of this information. I urge you to go look at the website that Ben referenced. Just Google the Citizens Police Data Project. What this data shows is one aspect of what impunity looks like. It's extraordinarily rare that a citizen, we've got tens of thousands of citizen complaints, and the full universe of data for the last 4 years. We'll ultimately get it back to 1967. What it shows is the officers were right to feel like they had impunity. I mean, there's an empirical basis for it, that the chance of being identified, if identified, the chance of having a complaint sustained anyway, it was exceptionally small. If sustained, it's almost, the chance of meaningful punishment is just infinitesimal. So, beyond some little reprimand that goes in your file that means nothing. So the system, I used to say, I said it a moment ago, that the system was broken. I think that's the wrong image. This isn't a broken system, although it is now with the implosion we've had recently. This was a system that was actually well-functioning, but for ends antithetical to the public interest and the public safety. It made the citizen complaints of serious constitutional violations and human rights violations disappear. There was a machinery for making these complaints disappear. The consequences of that, are huge, and that's what we see on the ground in the communities most affected. I referred initially to people who won't call the police, won't interact with the police or cooperate with the police in an investigation. It's it's hard to overstate how profound the alienation is in African American communities on the south and west sides of Chicago from the police, and by extension from civil authority. And I should say one other thing about the data, just in terms of the nature of the problem. Most police officers, the vast majority of police officers, so upwards of 83–84% of police officers get between 0 and 4 complaints from citizens in the course of their careers. 90% of police officers get less than 10 complaints. So a really small, and you could kind of keep going on that progression. So a relatively small but still significant number of officers, under 5%, account for a hugely disproportionate number of the complaints. And this is really, really highly patterned behavior. So officers don't commit abuse alone, or it's very rare. These are group phenomena. So you have officers with 60, 70 complaints in a matter of a few years who've never had a complaint sustained. You have teams of officers who all have high numbers of complaints, so it can't be a statistical anomaly, right? I mean, something's going on there. You have areas under particular supervision where there are lots of complaints. You have particular patterns of complaints, maybe not a high number of complaints, but if somebody's got 6 complaints, then they're all for sexual assault or weapon discharge violations. So amazingly, the department does no pattern analysis. It doesn't connect the dots in any way, even, a huge spike in complaints for an individual officer. So it's a kind of regime of not knowing. It's a system dedicated that functions for the city at the highest levels not to know things about really grave and fundamental human rights abuses of citizens that it's capable of knowing. So that creates these conditions of impunity, but it also has huge impact on the ground in neighborhoods where people know that it's unavailing to complain. So we, for the last 4 years, my colleagues and I have had a project called the Youth Police Project. And in the same way, our work at Stateway was so immersive, years, more than a decade in 8 square blocks of the South Side. We put a huge amount of energy into building conversations with black teenagers on the South Side about their interactions with the police. I've learned so much in the last few years from 17 and 18-year-olds. And one of the things they tell us, I'll reduce this to its sort of simplest form, but these are really, really consistent themes from these kids. These aren't attitudes, or they're striking. These are really thoughtful observations after lots and lots of talk and interaction. They tell us that when I go into an interaction with the police, I know 2 things going in. And I try to avoid these interactions as much as I can, but when I can't avoid it, I know 2 things. The first thing is they have all the power. The second thing is, if something happens, if this interaction goes bad, I won't be believed. Think about that. We're now not talking about the worst thing that ever happens, Laquan McDonald, police torture, although it's present because those things inhere in the small daily interactions. But imagine living under those conditions and having that define your relationship to the society. They have all the power, and if something happens, I won't be believed. There's no possibility of redress. And I often, I sometimes give the example just to capture how corrosive of people's identities and sense of being part of a larger civil order this is. Imagine that, for some reason, I always think about Haiti, Haiti for this purpose, but, we're in Haiti under Papa Doc, and we go out to dinner, and there was, as some of you probably know, a feared security force in Haiti, the Tatamakut, that sort of enforced the power of this dictator, and they wore recognizable clothes. So we have a really nice dinner, go out into the evening air, and 2 members of the Tatamakut come up and ask us for our passports and our papers. They walk away for 10 or 15 minutes. They come back and give us our passports and our papers and say, sorry for the inconvenience, hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in Haiti. That's a harrowing experience. That's a harrowing experience because they have all the power. And if something happens, we will disappear. We won't have, there's no mechanisms for us to get redress. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that there are routine interactions going on in the city of Chicago and other great urban areas between police and people of color and in certain neighborhoods that have that character, and they're constantly reproducing a sense of profound disenfranchisement and a kind of oppression. So the costs of all of this are immense, and it leads to to choices that people make, particularly young people, and I've had a lot of experience of this over the years. People are adaptive and they want to be safe. So you have these alternative public safety systems that take hold. The gangs are a lot of things. But they are profoundly public safety regimes, profoundly. And they can lead people to perilous places for sure, and are subject to their own grotesque, forms of corruption. But, it's classic. Read the Bible, read the Iliad. You mess with me and my people are going to mess with you is what people do in the absence of civil order. So you then have these cycles of retaliatory violence that are actually people pursuing a kind of rough justice when they can't trust the police and they can't trust the other institutions that the police are kind of the front line of. So we don't even know how to calculate the costs of abuse. There's a much quoted study that the Better Government Association did in Chicago that shows that in a 10-year period, recent 10-year period, the city paid out $500 million in settlements and awards in police abuse cases. But I would argue that that's just a fraction of the costs that we're incurring as a city for, to the extent that these conditions are unaddressed. The other consequence that beyond the human rights abuses and atrocities that occur that could be avoided, and the fundamental thing to remember is, the Laquan McDonald incident didn't have to happen. That was not some, Greek tragedy unfolding it didn't have to happen. It happened with this regime of not knowing and with these fundamental failures of accountability. But the other dimension of this is a relatively small number of police officers who are abusive undermine all the other police officers who are conscientious and who are trying to do their jobs. So that I've literally witnessed this in public housing. A single car, a single team of gang tactical officers who are corrupt, abusive, racist, and act with impunity can alienate a whole community from the police and from the civil order. So, if they were punished, if they were disciplined, then that formulation, they have all the power, I have no voice, no possibility of redress, begins to get, recalibrated. But as long as they have impunity, they have an incredibly disproportionate impact. And I spent a couple of years investigating one crew like that, known on the street as the Skullcap crew. They wore Navy watch caps, and gang tactical officers, corrupt, racist, completely brazen in, showing up daily at Robert Taylor and Stateway Gardens. And when they were really bearing down on somebody they were trying to coerce, where are the drugs, where are the guns, where's the money? The most threatening thing they would say was, don't you know, we're the real police. We're the real police. And what happens in the absence of accountability is those guys become the real police. And there are all sorts of other officers who are trying to do their jobs in those settings, but Officer Friendly has no chance when those are the real police. And they are the real police, and they become the face not just of the police department, but of the city, of the state, of the civil order. So, I want to turn to the prospects for reform, which are dramatic and exciting at the moment. But one other set of observations, I've really been describing the sort of formal mechanisms of accountability and their deficiencies and how those deficiencies contribute to impunity of that small but not insignificant number of officers disposed to be abusive. There also are other conditions that contribute to impunity and a whole informal set of mechanisms that are better referred to as sort of the culture of the police department. But first, one fundamental observation, and it took me, a while to fully grasp this because I was so focused on understanding these institutional mechanisms. And they're significant, and they could significantly be improved, and it would save lives. So I'm not minimizing that. But overwhelmingly, the biggest single factor conferring impunity on those disposed to be abusive in different ways is the social status of their victims. So, radical racial structures of racial inequality and exclusion that create the sort of space that existed at Stateway Gardens and exists in a number of other neighborhoods in the city is a huge factor in this sort of abuse, to the extent that we have people who are denied full citizenship. These sort of behaviors are inevitable, and the role of the war on drugs as it's been conducted in criminalizing whole populations, so they really have no. I mean that's a huge piece of this. The other dimension that I want to touch on, the cultural part of it, is you've heard the term the code of silence as a way of describing the internal culture of this department and other police departments. And, we have deposition testimony from multiple people within the department over the years denying that there's a code of silence. The favorite wisecrack among the authorities is, oh yeah, that's a Chuck Norris movie. So now it's, even the mayor has been forced to acknowledge the code of silence, in his recent utterances. And, part of what's important to understand, and I think code of silence is a term, there are these terms, particularly in the law, but that have a kind of aphoristic power, and they're vivid, and they give you access to perception, but they also sort of eclipse things at the same time. So it's a powerful half-truth. I mean, absolutely, there is coerced silence. There's this great pool of silence within the police department of officers who know things about criminal behavior within the department, but for fear of reprisals from fellow officers and their superiors, are silent. And there's another great pool of silence in the communities where people, know who's abusive, but don't report it because they have no belief that it will matter. But what isn't captured by the phrase is the sense in which the code of silence is really a matter of narrative control. It's really a matter of narrative control. And it's more often a matter of coercing officers to, either through their silence or through false utterance, to support an official narrative. And, Ben referred to the Laquan McDonald story that I've been very involved with. And probably people know many of the details. There's been such a tsunami of coverage, recently about it. And I wouldn't want to suggest for a minute that the execution of a child on the streets of Chicago is the norm. Such things happen too much, but they remain sort of exceptions from the norm. Everything that happened from the moment the barrage of gunshots ended, while the boy is still bleeding out on the street, everything that happened after that is normative. It is the norm. Immediately, there was a circling of the wagons. Immediately, occurrence witnesses, people who had been there, civilians who had seen it, were shooed away not taking statements, not taking contact information. Just get out of here or you'll get arrested. Several witnesses who had expressed themselves strongly about what they'd seen were taken to a nearby police station, held for several hours, and subjected to, I almost said a badgering interrogation, but it wasn't really an interrogation because it wasn't directed to learning what they knew, but sort of correcting their accounts. And among other things that were said, this was within 2 hours of the killing of Laquan McDonald. What these witnesses were told is, what you're saying, and they had vivid accounts, I've interviewed one of them, what you're saying can't be true. We have video that contradicts it. You can't have seen what you think you saw. As many of you know, a detective and a technician went into a nearby Burger King that had surveillance equipment, and we can't prove it, but there's reason to believe deleted the relevant footage that would have shown at least part of the incident. And then this, for me, is the ultimate character of the Code of Silence. So there was one officer who shot Laquan McDonald 16 times, Jason Van Dyke. There were 8 or 9 other officers on the scene. None of them fired. And a couple of them, the initial responders, had been with the boy for 5 or 6 minutes before his death and had handled the situation in exemplary fashion. They found the kid wandering around, a bit disassociated, with a knife with a 3-inch blade. Had asked him to drop the knife. He hadn't, but he wasn't aggressive. There's nobody around. They have all the time in the world. They stayed with him. They followed him, and didn't push the issue. They called in and asked. They didn't ask for backup. They asked for if somebody could bring a taser. Not necessarily, at least I infer, intending to use the taser, but thinking that might be the extent of force they would potentially need. So this officer had been with this boy, but other officers as well. I have no trouble extending the human sympathy to officers on the scene to think that they would have been as appalled as any of us by what they saw. They would have been as appalled, or the millions of people who've now seen the video. They go back to the station house after this, and I don't know the details, but I know how this generally works. And their sergeant or their lieutenant gives them a statement. This is how we're going to play this. This is the statement that you're going to give about what you saw. We've now seen those statements, and they are outright lies, complete fabrications. It's not the Rochamont effect or a matter of perspective or a matter of interpretation. They are lies. Well, just, extending sympathy to those officers, can you imagine worse working conditions? I mean, can you imagine? That's the character of the Code of Silence. And, it's just devastating, and it's real. I mean, people have real reason to fear all sorts of reprisals in terms of when they break ranks in that way. So, that's the situation. Those are sort of the conditions on the ground right now. And we've seen some of this, extraordinary stuff has come out, as a result of our lawsuit, but also the material that's come out about the Laquan McDonald case. We now have the email traffic within the department, and we're going to end up knowing more about this one case. And for me as a writer, it's something I truly wish I didn't, I've gotten lots of acknowledgement for it, which I appreciate, but I wish it wasn't on my resume. This was an utterly, infinitely regrettable thing that happened. Having said that, it's also a precious, precious resource now that it's this public narrative that, and we have an obligation to, I think truly almost sacred obligation to learn everything we can from this and other similar episodes. So what do we do at this point with what's to be learned? And I'll close shortly, but part of what has happened, I describe the Code of Silence as a matter of narrative control. And when you see, and it's worth at least, browsing through some of the emails within the city, and everybody's kind of looked for cover-up and this and that, and I think that's the wrong narrative frame for this. But what you see is just a huge amount of energy going into trying to control the narrative, this fundamentally false narrative. It's a false narrative in the micro sense about the individual's case, and in the macro sense about the state of the city. Huge energy going into that, to maintaining a world of appearances, a kind of curtain held in front of the world as it is. And what has happened, and it's extraordinary, is the city has lost control of the narrative. They have utterly and completely lost control of the narrative. I should have thought to bring it. There's a wonderful passage in a great essay called "The Power of the Powerless" by Václav Havel that he wrote in the 70s, when he's under house arrest long before his ascendancy to power in Czechoslovakia. And he describes precisely this dynamic of, a curtain wrapped around the world as it is. He's talking about a totalitarian or post-totalitarian regime. And the work, and certainly the work that I, and others are engaged in, of trying to create tears in that fabric, and then these extraordinary historical moments when the fabric just disintegrates. It's just disintegrating, and there's nothing that these very powerful institutions and individuals can do to restore it. We are in a moment of that kind of historical dimension. And I think it's important to understand what we're seeing as that curtain, the fabricated curtain disintegrates. The press, and I'm subject to this myself, it's always easier to tell a story within a frame of a crisis. I mean, that's a story in itself. A crisis is, by definition, a departure from the norm. What we are confronting is the norm. What we are confronting in Chicago and nationally in this extended post-Ferguson moment we're in, which, we should hope continues, is we're confronting the norm. We're confronting patterns of structural violence that are built into the society we live in, the society we have created, the society we have acquiesced in. There is no spike, all the Ferguson, Eric Gardner, name the names, we can name them, they now are the sort of shorthand, but they're shorthand for these structural conditions. There's been no spike in police violence nationally in this period. Police shootings are down in Chicago in the year of Laquan McDonald. We are looking at, as I say, structural violence built into the society we've created. And the reform agenda before us ultimately has to engage with that, or it will not produce, fundamental and enduring change. And I think that's the great moment we're in, because we have that opportunity and the great challenge. But it's completely a function of public attention and apprehension of these underlying realities. And the underlying realities we're seeing are the great unfinished business in American life. There's an extraordinary lawyer I've gotten to know recently, Bryan Stevenson. If you're not aware of him, you should check him out. And we were on a panel recently in Washington, and he's got this formulation that I think is really, really important, where he says that, and he's making a point about the civil rights movement, that we have a sort of narrative about the civil rights movement as this great watershed in American history, and not to minimize what was achieved. And it was a moment, obviously, that has some parallels with this moment. He said the critical thing to understand is that slavery didn't end. Slavery evolves. It evolves. And so, what we're seeing in these patterns of state violence is something that has a relationship to Jim Crow and lynchings during Jim Crow. It has antecedents. And, this is the great unfinished business in American life. And I think the challenge in addressing it, there are lots of obvious things to do in terms of reforming the police. And we sort of know what they are, and we've long known what they are. There, maybe some innovative things that will emerge as we go forward, if it's a robust and creative process going forward. But I think, and this is the sort of thought I want to leave you with, and then I look forward to engaging in conversation, is this great blood knot at the center of American life with respect to race. It has to do with our ability to know things and not know them at the same time. And the challenge now is to find the political will and the sense of agency to act on what we know. And if we do, then what we are engaged in, it starts, we have to articulate a path forward. It starts with low-hanging fruit, fixing the investigative agencies in the police department. But what we're ultimately engaged in, and this is a huge opportunity and a huge challenge if we can find the capacity and the political will to do it, we're engaged in changing the society and changing the kind of society we live in and addressing, as I say, the fundamental questions and issues in American life. And so it's an extraordinary moment, it's an exciting moment, exhilarating at times, but also it's going to require things of all of us. And that's why the image that I began with feels to me a necessary image to end with. We live in a broken city. We all live in a broken city. It's not just the people who live in the neighborhoods most affected. It's not just the police. It's all of us. And so the great challenge and the great opportunity is to figure out our individual pieces of that and ways in which we can act responsibly at this historic moment. Thank you.
First of all, thanks for coming out today.
Sure.
That was a wonderful talk. You threw a lot at us. What I wanted to ask was, towards the beginning, you sort of alluded to this idea of the public taking back the police misconduct, like taking ownership of our knowledge of that. So I'm just kind of curious, what would you propose that we do in the future in order to take that back, to take that ownership? Is it something that requires, maybe like jurisprudence, like setting a precedent in court, or is it maybe more of a civic engagement sort of thing?
I appreciate the question. So one of the ways in which we describe our work at the Invisible Institute, and particularly the Citizens Police Data Project, which I urge people to take a look at, is we're not pounding on the door. We have relationships at a high level in the city, negotiate. I've even, at the height of the Laquan McDonald, that sort of perfect storm back in December, I got a couple of calls from the mayor. We have a relationship, but the heart of what we're trying to do is to create in civil society a robust enough entity to enforce respect for human rights and ensure that abuses are addressed. So we're not so much pounding on the door of the city saying, fix this, as saying, we as citizens are taking co-responsibility for these conditions in our society. And there are models for that, in South Africa, in the movements in Central Europe, that notion of a really robust sense of the power that citizens have. And, one of the things that's always moved me, I alluded before, and it's shaped my own practice, to the Havel essay, The Power of the Powerless, which I urge on you to read. I think it's online and easy to find, is, it's this vision that we've seen in great movements where it's not a matter of seizing power. And it's not a matter of cozying up to power. It's a matter of generating power, generating power. And I closed with that formulation about our ability to know and not know with respect to fundamental issues of race. And I think a lot of that arises out of just a kind of civic demoralization. And the civic demoralization gives carte blanche to power, to the power structure. So it's kind of appropriate that we began with the singing of Imagine. I mean, I think there does need to be some capacity to imagine alternatives and alternative possibilities. So for us, it starts with, sort of breaking down the wall of official secrecy, having this information, but it doesn't end there. I mean, we have made this information wholly public. We've built our site from the ground up as open source. We really want everybody in, everybody to participate. It's immediately useful to lawyers, journalists, but above all, we hope the general public. There is a challenge, though, and I think there's some really interesting organizing strategies that are possible here that we're trying to develop is, my reporting, the reporting of my colleagues, the Citizens Police Data Project, we're engaged in a really sustained effort to critique the existing systems, to diagnose them, to do a demonstration project through the database of what the police department and the city could be doing with this information if it connected the dots, turned it into real actionable knowledge. But we don't want that process of demonstrating how deficient the existing systems are to further alienate people from engaging. I mean, I think that's a real challenge. So one of the things we're doing is developing what we're calling a report builder. I think we'll come up with a better name. But the idea being we're going to create tools, including apps on people's cell phones and stuff, that enable people to generate complaints that are formal complaints to the police department that we then can monitor, serve as ombudsman for, can provide support for people. It's not a particularly welcoming or hospitable process for people. So, and I think that could be, I look at a group like this, and there was an early version of this long before the technology was available called Citizens Alert, which brought people in various kinds of organized groups, congregations, groups like this, civic groups, into relationship with individuals who had reason to complain, and it was a kind of strategy of accompaniment, helping people, supporting them in engaging with this system that can be so. And I think there's a tremendous amount, that could be done with that. I think it's also the case that, in saying that ultimately we have to engage in a sustained and honest way with bedrock issues of racial inequality to emerge from this process with really fundamental reforms. I didn't mean to suggest that there aren't a whole roster of very concrete interventions and remedies that can be undertaken now. So I think it's also important. It's also important, and we see what we do at the Invisible Institute and others working in this field as enabling an ever broader constituency of people to become knowledgeable and to advocate for and support those concrete reforms. It's kind of complicated right now, and you see young people in the streets. Black Lives Matter has been, tremendously important in all of this. But there's also a dimension there where when people comprehend grave harms, when you see grave harms, I think it's just human nature to want to have remedies that are commensurate with the harms. I think that's why societies often go to war, because you need something that's big, that feels like it can address these harms and grievances. There are no big remedies. There are lots of small, concrete, common sense things that can be done that in the aggregate might be transformative, but not, change systems, change cultures. So we need, to build a constituency, and again, not just in the neighborhoods most affected, of people who are advocating effectively for those kinds of changes. So the paradox of our moment is it may well prove to be a transformative moment, but there are no transformative remedies. So we need to build a practical politics behind this.
Wouldn't you think that ending the war on drugs and making it so that if you're convicted of the fact that a felony conviction means that you don't necessarily lose your right to vote, wouldn't that be a transformative remedy?
It would be a big deal. It would be a big deal. And, but I think, I always think back to, we've been celebrating Selma. So I wholly agree, substantively. And I think the way in which the war on drugs has been conducted has been catastrophic in so many different ways. And this is just one of them in terms of the kind of ecosystem it creates for corruption and abuse, within the police department. Dismantling something like the war on drugs, we're in an era where for at least 10 years there have been searching critiques of mass incarceration driven significantly by the war on drugs, and the juggernaut continues, going forward. There are lots of political figures who are bought in, including our county president in Cook County, to the need to end the war on drugs and reverse mass incarceration. But I think changing these systems is not simply declaring the war over and leaving a foreign land. So the dismantling of that is a pretty heavy lift. But I agree, it would be transformative. But I think again, it's all these small moves. So I think about this in relation to this last year being the 50th anniversary of Selma, of the marches in Selma, and the obvious sort of parallels with this moment. And Selma was a transformative moment. It was a huge sort of, in some ways, the Laquan McDonald stuff and others have had the same quality of dramatizing in our public life a set of profound themes, so hugely, kind of epic moment. But Selma was about the Voting Rights Act, which was really concrete, was about poll taxes and, literacy bars to voting and other, that's really what it was about. And so it would be transformative, and I think there are ways to transform our understanding of public safety, but the process is really granular, and it's a matter of sort of having both a sense of sequence and priority and building a larger public understanding that takes on something as large as the war on drugs.
Thank you. Can you comment on what happens when false narratives and coerced confessions result in the conviction of people who may not be guilty of what they're accused?
Immense injustice, and it's a huge ongoing part of the machinery. It's a huge ongoing part of the machinery. I'm writing right now about, I think I alluded to this earlier, a sort of protection racket within public housing that went on for a decade, and a decade during which there were open investigations by 3 different agencies, the FBI, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and Internal Affairs of the police. And this is, police officers on a weekly basis collecting a tax that could be as much as $50,000 for a high-rise building from drug dealers. An integral part of that whole machinery was false arrest. Nobody was ever arrested for, these officers who are running the protection racket met their quotas and met their numbers, but it was often coercing people to cooperate in their criminal enterprises. And if you don't, we're going to put a case on you and put you in jail. So I think we're just, I'm looking at Pam, with the Innocence Project, I think we're just beginning to discern the tip of the iceberg of, of that dynamic. And there are countless people in prison who don't belong there. And, and it's shameful. It's shameful. And hopefully, again, that's one of those areas, one of the, in this kind of multi-front struggle, one of the areas where we can make significant progress in coming years.
I think we only have time for 2 more questions, so I'm going to be disappointing a batch of you, but...
Are there police departments that get it right anywhere in the country?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, there are police departments that have been through the process that Chicago is entering into now with federal oversight, ultimately a consent decree, and a judge overseeing the police department as it goes through reform. LA being the most prominent example on a similar scale. And there's no question that there are really important and significant reforms that come from that kind of top-down thing. I think they're also limited. And, I made a distinction before between kind of procedural, institutional things and culture. And one of the things that is apparent in Chicago and elsewhere is in the absence of real deep cultural change, sort of from the ground up in a department, culture always trumps procedure. There will always be workarounds. There will always be, strategies. So the challenge is twofold, the kind of institutional changes that can be imposed from the top, but then the cultural change that really requires a kind of leadership, and not just at the level of the superintendent. It's got to come down to the sergeant level through the whole command structure, a real change in the character and ethos of leadership that works over time to shift the incentive-disincentive structure, so that I truly believe that the real agents of change, if we're going to have significant change in Chicago, are police officers, rank and file, and people in the communities, because they all know the realities, but they're kind of atomized in that knowledge and limited in their agency. So, to create a culture in which good police officers can be agents in weeding out bad police officers would really be transformative, to use that word. I think just one other observation about your question, I think that, and I've seen this in a couple of smaller jurisdictions, a smaller police department, a smaller jurisdiction allows much more, allows leadership to play a much larger role. To take over the Chicago Police Department, between 12 and 13,000 officers, each district a kind of police department unto itself. That's really, really difficult. There are smaller jurisdictions where visionary police executives have come in and made a big difference. If you've got a couple hundred, 300, 400 officers, you can know all of them by name. You can have a relationship with all of them. And I think there's a different kind of accountability that can come out of that. So yes, and I think the interesting thing going forward is there are important things that can happen in terms of reform at the federal level, uniform reporting expectations, and there are a range of things that can be done at the federal level, but ultimately the change is going to come at the local level, and goes back to that sense of just sort of personal responsibility and engagement between citizens and the police that I spoke of at the end of my remarks. And then what's going to be interesting, and it's already happening, is the sort of cross-pollination between different jurisdictions. So with our data project, we're negotiating a scope right now to work with the police monitor in New Orleans. Los Angeles County is interested. There's some interest in Denver. So, so we have a set of strategies and tools and favorable legal conditions in Illinois for developing a model of transparency in law enforcement. And we're looking for ways, without getting overextended, of being a resource to others elsewhere. So I think that's going to be one of the modes of change going forward.
My question is basically about safety. I mean, when we talk about the real police, and we talk about persons that take an interest and that are active, they can do anything they want to you.
Yep.
And how do you, even singularly and in a group, be safe?
It's a good question. I've certainly had my adventures over the years in that regard. But I think you alluded to part of the answer, which is there are things that are really hard and genuinely dangerous and even self-sacrificial to do alone that are possible to do together. And that's what effective movements are, is people entering into a kind of solidarity with each other that enables all of us to be more effective. And it's one of the things that actually I think of in relation to the police department and to police officers under the Code of Silence, but I think it could also be extended to citizens, particularly in the neighborhoods most affected as far as addressing these things. Somebody said, probably multiple people said various forms of this with respect to totalitarian regimes, that a society and a polity in which you have to be a hero or a martyr to just behave decently as a friend, as a neighbor, as a colleague, to do your job, is a seriously screwed up society. And we certainly have a police department where, in order to really honor your oath and report crime when and wherever you see it, including within the department, you have to take extraordinary risks. So that's one measure of the dysfunction within the police department. I think there's a kind of a similar point that can be made about what's required of individual citizens. But I guess the two things I would say is just to repeat the point about the power we have together, and the second is, I'm pretty far down a road in doing this work, but it's really empowering and liberating just not to be afraid. I think, so much of what we deplore in the world and would like to see different depends on our actually being afraid, being afraid and being demoralized. And I do think, as individuals, it's possible to push past that. Not in, big heroic gestures, but in small steps in a particular direction. And, one of the, I don't want to over-dramatize anything, but, one of the, amid all that is infuriating, heartbreaking about the kind of work that I do, one of the things that's exhilarating about it is, not being afraid, pushing back, having some tools and colleagues and all in resisting things that we know are unjust and in some instances truly evil. And so whatever risks are involved, that sense of agency and freedom that comes when you don't allow yourself to be intimidated, it seems to me worth it. And again, that's what people do together. That's what movements do together. And I've often, I think I was talking about denial before, and I don't see denial in most of the forms in which I've encountered it or practiced it as a matter of, I don't see it as a matter of people being craven or without fellow feeling or empathy. It's more the fact that we can't look at horrible, intolerable conditions and hold them in focus if we have no sense of agency to change them. And so I think part of what happens with movements, when movements take hold, is a kind of feedback loop, a sort of feedback loop between action and perception. So there's some things you just can't think your way through. You need to act, you need to intervene in the world. When you do that, you create a little more space for perception. You know, the perception and the access to perception informs action going forward. And so I've often sort of thought it's such an interesting word, movement, when we describe these sort of social impulses that take hold at different points in history. And if you ask yourself, what moves when a movement moves? I think it's that dynamic. You know, it's that dynamic of acting in the world, gaining insight in the course of acting, and having what you learn inform the next things you do. And you know, and if you read Gandhi, as I've done a great deal, or Martin Luther King, or Havel, and the Central Europeans, they all describe sort of the same process in that respect. And it's, you know, it's a truly exciting thing when you have any part of it. And I guess, again, to close on the same note, we're in that kind of moment when that's possible and indeed is required of us.